Ches, Hemshech Ayin Beis, Chelik Aleph, Amud Tov Kof Beis, Korav L'Seifa, Tov Kof Gimel. I think that's enough, right? Yeah. Good. So we saw the Hamshocha Habo B'derech Hishtalsheles, and the Hamshocha Habo Milamayla Miseda Hishtalsheles. And we saw that that even though from Arich, the Madrege or the Klodas Ha'inyan of Arich Anpin to Chochma, the Atzilus was Derech Cyrus Bilvad. Nonetheless, we said that the Seder from Lamayla Mea Chochma to Chochma, which is Derech Cyrus, but that's not a inyan from the Ilava Orul. Nonetheless, it's considered that, or it's all part of the Geder, we saw the Lashon Geder, of the Geder of Hishtalsheles. It's not the inyan of what we described Hishtalsheles Lashon Shils, the Shil Shel inyan Milmayla Lamata, but even that the Elyon is Nimshech El Atachtein, and even from Kiruv or even Mahus, and the inyan from Cyrus is a inyan from Hamshocha B'derech Dilug, not B'derech Ilava Olo. So we saw a wondrous Nakuda that the inyan of Seder Hishtalsheles was determined by the Ratzon HaPoshut of the Eibishter Baruch Hu in Klodas Inyan of Hishtalsheles. That the Eibishter, from the beginning of all the Seder, of all the Giluyim and all the Hamshochas that brought about the Hishtalsheles B'Puyo, even in the Madregas Koydem HaTzimtzum, we saw that the Aliyas HaRotzen Al Inyan HaOlemes, or that was a Rotzen Miyuchad She'inyoni Hu Hishtalsheles. That the Iker Rotzen, which is Lahachil V'Livro, it brought down in the Kisvei Arizal, is going to get to the inyan what we call Hishtalsheles Olemes. The way the Rotzen foresaw that Hishtalsheles, and the way the Rotzen was koiveya that Hishtalsheles, wasn't only in the inyan from Ilava Olel Bilvad. Even in the inyanim which are Shaloi B'derech Ilava Olel, Ela B'derech Dilug or Richuk Ha'erech, somewhat. But that's the inyan of the Cyrus from, if we take the inyan from Olam HaBriya to Chochma the Yetzirah, or if we take the inyan from Chochma the Briya from Malchus Datzilas, then these Hamshochas are B'derech Cyrus, but that's a inyan not Ilava Olel, it's in from Richuk Ha'erech. But that was considered, that was foreseen in the original Rotzen, that's how the whole Seder of the Yeridus Shefa, to bring about Isavas and to be Makayim the inyan of the Seder, the Isavas Oilemes, even from Lahatzil, Benaget to the Spheres, and Livroi, Benaget to the Oilemes Priya, Yetzirah Vasiyah. Well, that was all kavua in the Rotzen Balias, Rotzen Eitzel Hamatzil, how he was Koydem HaTzimtzum. Meaning that all of those inyonim which made the Yisavas Ha'olames, but even that the Kilo Nimshochim or Mishtalshelim, Echad Me'asheni, I feel that's not B'derech Ilava Orel, Inyonim Musiyomim, but it's all called Seder Hishtalsheles, because that's what the Eibishter saw originally from the very first beginning. B'atzmusi is Baruch all the way down, Latati is Ha'asiyah, that there would be a Seder in the Giluyim, and that's how he foresaw the whole passage of the Bria from one stage to another, as you might say, all the way down In other words, that the original Ratzon foresaw the whole Seder of Eilemes Vehisavuson Mireish Kol Dagen and Tzov Kol Dagen. That's called Seder Histaushel. So in a Chanami, there's certain inyonim in that which are not B'derech Ileva Olav Kiruv, but they're called the Geder of Seder Histaushel. Ki Kach Kova Harotzen Betchilas Kol Habrio Tchilas Kol Ha'inyonim Afilo in the Madregas Koidam Achimtzon. And that was, we saw, that's called the Amshocha B'derech Histaushel. Aval Amshocha Bol L'mayla Misei Histaushel, we saw at the end of the last os. Haina Mashanim Shul Mipinas Atik or Moiches Timoa Shuhu Pnimis HaKeser. We saw that the Pnimis of Arik, which is Moiches Timoa, Chochma Sheba Arik, there is Nimshuk, but Pnimis or Bislabshas Atik. And we saw that Atik is Loshen Ner Takva Nivdal, that Atik is Mamish Elakus, how he's moved out from the whole Seder of Ishtaushel Ho'elemas, who biatzmei Einu Niklal in the Indian of Seder Ishtaushel, which means that the Eibishter allowed there to be certain Giluim which weren't necessarily Niklal in the Seder Ishtaushel. And albeit the Indian from Moiches Timoa is part of the Seder Ishtaushel, because Moiches Timoa is, as we saw, it's Chochmas Timoa, Chochmas Sheba Arik. But nonetheless, there's mislabish b'derech pnimius in that madrega of Moiches Timoa, a'inim which is legamri l'mayla from that whole seder. And we saw that was the inim from Tosefus and what we described earlier in the whole Emshech Oyer Chodosh, a'inim from Ischatches, that wasn't there tchila b'aliyas harotzen al Seder Histaushel Desesphere. In other words, in the whole aliyas harotzen that the Eibishter had in the Klolos Ha'ishavus and the whole Seder of the Spheres and later the Eilemes, or those inyonim weren't included in that Aliyas Harotzim. We have to say that that's Ayin for Nishchadches Kaviohu Afilo Lagabi the Eibishter, even though this is Zicher that in the Kavona Pnimius, how it is Mitzad Atzmus, that everything is Tzafui Galui V'Yadua Lefonov, alle inyanim which will ever be and ever could be, but when I get to the inyan of Ishtaushel, then they're michutz le'inyan Seder Hazeh, and their entry into Seder Histaushel is purely mitzad eize inyan, which is also not lefi Ishtaushel how it's neged to the Adam. It doesn't come lefi how he's part of Ishtaushel and all of Ishtaushel hakoiches. He can only be Megala on and be Mo'oira, and that's what we saw, that there's also a Haloas Man to be Megala these inyonim which are chutz mi'a rotzen al klolos haseder. Even though we have to say that there's a rotzen also mitzad ha'atzmus mamish even on these inyonim. But they're not in the whole inyan of the seder, and kilu they wait and they wouldn't be Megala if there weren't these inyonim alidei ha Tachtoin, what he's Mo'era Bahalos Man, and we saw that was the in von Umke de Liebe, Mimamakim Krosicha, Miprinas Oimek lo Oimek. In other words, it in Oimek Gufa, Ain Shal Oimek. Vahainu Shali Deise, Mamshichim, Mimochim Gavoim Ha'id, Shalamayla Mehadroges Aishtaushles. It's beyond the whole Indian of that Geder and the Seder of steps, literally, which is the Indian of Ishtaushel. Ach, Mikol Mochim, Gamam Shochazu, Muchrach, Gam Kein Leire, Derech Hatzinoides, Va'asaires, the Yud Gimel Tkunei, Dikna. He said, nonetheless, he said, even this level, which is Chutz Mi, Aliyas Harotzen al Inyan Ishtaushel, it's also Muchrach. It has to somehow or another be obliged to be Nimshach through the Tzinoires and the Saires of Yud Gimel Tkunei Dikna.
Yeah, when it says here Oimek LaOimek, maybe the Kavanah is the Oimek of the Adam calling to the Oimek of
Yes, but l'chayra, yeah, one can taste like that. But l'chayra, what it means is even l'gabi a madrega, which is considered oimek, even that is an oimek. Understand? Oimek, li oimek means oimek, l'gabi an oimek. You understand? Not that one oimek is calling to the other oimek, but it's more of a enochanami. But it more correctly, the nakuda is, it's a oimek legabi a already established oimek. Dainu, if we take Lamaila, the inifan arich afilu b'chitzayni yusei is oimek legabi sayidi shtalshos. The whole esospheres and everything all klulim there, and even from klolas, inifan rotzen v'chulu. Yeah, moiches timoa im eich atik yoimen is mamish mislabish moiches timoa. That's an oimek even legabi oimek. And by the odom tshuva miyum kedelibo, we went into that. Various in one of the previous classes, that there's a whole union of kol pnimoa, the loyeshtama, and in that gufa two madregas. There's a union for a kol pnimoa, the loyeshtama mamish, even legabe a kol pnimoa, the loyeshtama. That's union for chuvin, even oimekle, yeah, lo oimek, and that's mo'iran, that's the aloes man, to be mo'irat, the union from atik yoimen, how it's found, be a slabsus pnimias. However, what is very noticeable, and what you might call almost the expression boilet, is the lashon mukrach, that even this gilui or this amshocha, we won't call it gilui because it's lamayla mi gilui, or this inyan atzmi shel lamayla mi ishtaushlis and lamayla mi hadrogas for rotzen al ishtaushlis. Is mukhrach, it must and it has to be nimshach through what you might call the established ways of Sayyid Ishtausha. Because the infant Yud Gimel Tkuni Tikna, we pointed out that in Moicha Stimoa itself there's a level which is only Sosum Stimoa Lagabi de Mekablin Bilvad. And we saw that was a infant Moiserei Moichin, and that was a chitzenius lagabi the pneumius of moichas timoa, which is mamishati. So therefore, the Yud Gimel Tkuni Dedikna, they have a certain shaychus also the shtaushlas, because that's the Indian how it's nimshel mitzad chitzenius moichas timoa. That's also called Yud Gimel Tkuni Dedikna. However, he said that those same Yud Gimel Tkuni Dedikna, they become a medium through which the atzmiyas of moichas timoa, I know reisha delois yada, or pnimisatik mamish, they're going to be nimshach through the same Yud Gimel Tkini Dikno. And he said it has to be there, mukrach. And then he goes on to say that it's through the tsenoiros vasayris. So what's this lotion tsenoiros all of a sudden? Sayris we've been talking about the whole time. Also in the lotion tsenoiros and sayris. So we're going to see l'choira that inside this gufa there's an inyan which is chitonias, and then we're going to see there's an inyan inside this gufa which is shaykh only to panemias, and that's what we pointed out in a previous class, that tzayros have in themselves two inyanim. They have the cholol, how do you call it, the actual outside, or the reed, the actual shell of the sayah. Yeah, but that's the what you might call the bamboo on the outside, as it were. And then there's a cholol pnimi inside. So when he says the inyan from sayres vi chinoiros, he's talking about that's a remus to the fact that all sayres have in themselves the chitonias, and then they have a inyan shel pnimius. Well, that's the chinoir, the inner pnimius of the sayir. But when the amshocha atzmis occurs, then the ike in the sayres is that chinoir pnimi, and the outside is only a min ma'avibul, but only a min tzimtzum atzmiyah, which allows and brings that the atzmiyah comes into a certain tzimtzum, or his tzamtzumas, certain katnas, not katnas be'etzim kamovan, holiday the thinner of the siders. It's remember the fitziness of the siders is more shot to the outside of the siders, just the fact that there's a tzimtzum. And that gufa goes through the pnimis of the side of a nizdos of the rika. And then there's another inyan inside us where the whole inyan of the sayar is only to bring, and that's this idea of a funnel, it's only to bring the etzem shefa, kamoishu derech that tzimtzum, of a bli lishanais et atzmius ha-shefa. The thing remains an etzem. And mamira, that's the pshat, that it's mukhrach leireit. Yesh lema the view and that ocean mukhrach has to go down through the union of the Tzenoides or Istauselis, which are the Yud Gimel in this part, and later Beklal the union of Istauselis, particularly the Siders Shabahim. Why do we say it's Mukhrach? Because we're talking about the Amshocha of an Atzmiyas. In Amira, an Atzmiyas can only be Nimshak for Moishehu. Is Amira Etzem is Lamaila Mehelem Vagilo. In Etzem itself, not Shach, not Helem, but not Giloi. And therefore, in order to bring down the Atzmas, you've got to, as it were, fakvetch the Atzmas in such a way that it'll be able to come into the limited area that you want it. And it's not a union for Makiv. Now, Makiv is where you've got oiros, which are only ha'oras, but they're ha'oras which are too big for the makablim, and therefore they're meir, but they're not makiv. And in that guf you can have kama inyonim. Of a so, the makiv is only a min chitzonius azar, kemavur, bekama makaimus. As a etzem should be nimshach, and the etzem atzmusi is, atzmius, of an atzmus should be nimshach, well that has to go through a tzamstumus musuyemas. It's got to go in a way like a funnel, that's something which will bring it and allow it to enter the whole area that we're talking about. And that's El Dera where we find the famous Loshen. And I saw it put down in, that was interesting, I saw it put down on some of our, close to where we're learning, and so it's interesting how there always seems to be some sort of connection between the two inyonim, and that is Tzimtzem, that the Eibusher will mitzamtzem shchinosei bein shnei badei oren. In other words, that once the sanctuary was built, then the Eibusher used to talk to Moshe Rabbeinu, Amos used to talk to him inside the Mishkan, but first of all the coal was yered bein shnei badei oren, and then it was v'yetze derech ha'pareches, and it was b'tech ulam, and Moshe Rabbeinu heard it, and then he went out and gave it. Over to Yidden, and so the sages call that whole gilui tzimtzem shchinosei bein shnei badei arein, and so orein. And so this is mavaya that when you say tzimtzem shnei shchinosei bein shnei badei orein, well, what you mean is that the etzem shechina itself, the etzem atzmius of the shechina, that's how they call it Constantina, it crashed itself in such a way that it was able to appear and talk by shnei badei orein. In other words, you just took the etzem kamoishu and made it appear in a smaller place, as you might say, in a limited place. But this is the etzem. It's an ishka makiv, and it's even in a way, this is the pnimius of pnimius. In other words, that in pnimius kufa, this is the etzem pnimius, which is meant to be in pnimius, or can only be in pnimius. So that's what it is mukhrach. It has to be that way, because otherwise, the etzem is just too etzem. It's not going to be able kaviyachol to appear in a given way. The etzem has to catch its own self in order to appear in a given mokim or in a given inyan almanas lifeil at inyan ha'etzem. That's what the Rebbe says, that it's mukhrach gam kein later derech hatzinoides v'asaides, and we've made the deal of tzinoides v'asaides. After it became nikros ela maila misay the east ausvers, given shesherish am shochazu, whom we raised lo is yado mi moichas dir, Stimoa, Reisha Loisiana means Pneumisatic Mamish. And where is that? That's in Moiras in Chochmas Stimoa, in Pneumias Chochmas Stimoa. And here we see that the Atzmias Davke has to go also through the Tzinoiras, and it doesn't come b'derech Makiv. Because a Makiv is only in Oyer, a Makiv is only in Ha'ora. So you have a higher Ha'ora, a more Metzumtzum Dika Ha'ora. The higher Ha'ora is Meir derech Makiv. Of a Atzmias Manish, Atzmias kommt, it has, since we want Atzmias to be Begolid to the Makablim, then it's got to come in a way that it goes through. When I say Begolid, then it'll be Mashpia and Noisen es Atzmiusai. Lea Makablim, it goes in a way more that comes, Davke be Itzamtzemus derech the Cyrus of, say, the Histauchelos. Even though those Cyrus themselves are in say the Histauchelos Kufa a Hecher Inin, but they're called say the Histauchelos. But in the Cyrus Kufa, the Pnimis and the Tzinoyer Bilvad of the, and Yesh Loma, that Loshen Tzinoyer is a remes to the fact that when you take a funnel, for example, you put a shefa into the Tzinoyer, that all it does is leave the shefa as it is, but it just mitzamtzim that it should be able to appear in a certain calculated point or area. That's Yesh Loma does it in it. And therefore, Kol Zeh is a remes, and it's well known. What the Rizal said, that Liotzid will be the Gilui of Pneumisatic. But all them shoches ad Iskalis of Melech HaMashiach, all them Beis Yuevin, me Chitoniasatic, or me Alich, or Chayzen, I feel the highest in Yonim. But Mashiach will be Megalad even Pneumisatic, the Hainu dem Shocha Atzmius Mamish. And so that's going to be Davki Boivin Shaloya Pnimi Kiyodua. Aliyosid, all the Inyonim are going to be Nimshach Davki Boer Pnimi. In other words, not that that's going to be Ainian Mitzumtzum Ha'ora Mitzumtzemus, which is now Meir B'derech Pnimi. It's going to be the Atzmas. Like he says, Zeh Mukhrach Lava Gamkin Derech the Tzinoiris, but it'll be over Derech the Pnimius and Atzmis of the Tzinoiris Gufia. In other words, what is the Ike is that Cholol, or that Tzinoir Pnimi inside the Seyah. Did we learn the Kitzur last time? I suppose nobody remembers. I don't think we did. No.
Yossi said he didn't.
Huh?
Yossi said he didn't.
We didn't.
We did not.
Right.
So your Tzidlavo, it's still going to be Derech Saras.
Huh?
But Tzidlavo is still going to be
Yeah. The Yossi Love will be the Yud Gimel Mitzvah Rachim and the Inyan from Sidais, and then even more than that, there'll be all the Inyanim of Histauchelos. But we'll be over in that the Atzmius Mamish.
See, because if it's a Tzimtzum, the definition it can't be a Tzim.
Oh, that's what we're saying. There are two different types of Tzimtzum. One symptom is where you're Masalik at the beginning, the etzim of what you're dealing with, and you leave only ha'oras, yeah? And then in those ha'oras you make miutim, or you make helomas of a stadium, yeah? Or you're bringing the atzmius mamish, and all you do is press the atzmius kaviyah, you press it, and you had a quote, you verquetch, that's like a concertina, you just take the whole thing and push it into a small area, and that's a pshat. That loshen tzimtzem shchinos bein shnei badio. He pushed it in between the two badio. That's what we call tzimtzum ha'etzem, or he tzamtzemus ha'atzmi. That's what he's talking about here. That's the pshat. That's going to be the oifen of all the amshochas liyasi. That all of them will come, but the oilemus will still be there, and all of them will come. And yet, nonetheless, the atzmus will be miskala b'derech hatzinoiris v'asayres v'chulu, or the etzem atzmi itself will be nature. And that's what he said. That's the nakuda what he's must be here.
It's a tamtzit, not really a tzimtzum.
Yeah, it's not a tamtzit either. Because a tamtzit is also, how do you call it? Kfitza mi ha'inyonim. No, the atzmis mamish, not just a tamtzit. The atzmis mamish. A tamtzit is like a form of a taking out of it, leaving over. No, the etzim kamoshu, that's a pshat tzimtzum shchinosa. That the etzim shchina itself came shchinosa. How he's mamish miyuchad im shchinosa. So die Savas HaChochma, Umibchines Cyrus, the Moichesti, the Hine Mazel V'Neitzer, or Neitzer Chesed, or V'Neitzer Chesed, or however we'll go with it. Yesh Boi Pnimis V'Che, 10 years. And we saw that Misham Nimshochin Beis B'Chines Moichim. And we saw the Hine Ishtaushas as Firas, Hu B'Chines Yeliva Olo. Yeah, Beis B'Chines Moichim, we saw that was the in the Machif the Yosh, which is Shai to the Makablim. We saw that was only the Gabi Moichas Timor, that was only Moiseres of the Moichim. But the Amshocha B'Chines Atzmius Ati, which is the Machif the Erechoize, if that is Nimshot, then that's Atzmius HaMoichim, Atzmius Moichas Timor. The Hine Ishtaushas as Firas of B'Chines Yeliva Olo. גם מהכסר לחוכמה שהוא בדרך סיירס, שזהו רק האורה, לא האורה עצמיאס כמו מחוכמה לבינה או מבינה למידס. So if it's only a ha'ora and not a ha'ora which has got the atzmius in it, then it's not ishtaushel. We call mohim gam zehu seider ishtaushel. Mipnei shekein nimdad b'aliyas harotzen batchilo. That in the etzem madregas, in the madrega koida matzimtzom, which we call aliyas harotzen, that's how it was oile, that's how it was meshuar, or that whole inyan of reish kol dag and sof kol dag in mechubarim umishtaushelim zemizeh. Yesh moichin de lamayla mishtaushel. Now why do we call it moichin? It's coming from moichas timor. It's in and is also chochma. Or be in that chochma gufa the gile of the etzem. V'hainu shalei nimdad b'aliyas harotzen, v'nimshochin gam kein derech hasayreis. We're not going to be much with the pnimius of that in and how they nimshach derech hasayreis, and we'll be mefater that in which I just said when I get to the amshocha atzmi. V'inin hu the amshocha shall pi seide shtaushles, he mipchines arich. Arich Anpin, Shur Shanet Solim. Shezehu Masha Shaykh Ela Nitzolim. That's well known that we saw that Moichas Timor is Chochma Shabarich. Imamela, there's a inen in Moichas Timor which is Shaykh to Arich. So even though that's a Makif, but we saw that it's a Gabi Atzilas, what we saw was a Makif of Eur Yoshua. It's a Makif which is Shaykh to come to them, Kablim, and to be Miskalet to them. Therefore, it's a inyan of kiruv al chaponim to the makablim, and we saw that that's shorish on netzolim, shezo ma sheshayach el netzolim. In other words, why do we say that arich b'derech klal? We use the expression that shorish hanetzolim. That's what we say, and atik is moved on me on netzolim. Ki sof koso, for those reasons which we just gave, arich is shayach to the netzolim. Ukenoida. The Arich Anpin Upchines Rotzen. Why is it called Makif, but nonetheless Shaykh to the Netzolim? Because it's an Inyan from Rotzen. But he said, Hainu, what sort of Inyan in Rotzen? Not a Rotzen Achmi, which is moved out Mikol Ha'inyonim, but as a Rotzen, which is Rotzena Yizbara, but even Aishtauselas. Like we just saw that even in Aliyas HaRotzen, Koida Matzimtzum, or the whole purpose of that Rotzen was to determine the whole Seder and to be Megala and, as it were, want and determine the whole Seder of Ishtaushlos. Therefore, that's what we call Arich Rotzen, we mean that Rotzen, or that Indian of the Aliyas Rotzen. That's what he says now. Ubishar Shei, Ubchinas Rotzen, Poshut, Erein Seif, She'ola Beretzeina Ilahat Silver, Livroi, that's what we call the Aliyas Harotzen, how it was Koidem Hatzimtzum, and that Aliyas Harotzen Bi'ikar was concerned with the Indian of Livroi, Lahatzil, Livroi. First of all, to be Megala, the whole side of the Spheres, from Ach and then through Akudim and the whole Riches into Atzilas, and then the Indian of Yesh Mi'ayin from Malchus Tatzilus into the Bria Yetzirah Vasiyah, and again that's got in itself Mamish Ayin and Sheyesh Mi'ayin, but we saw that nonetheless, even those Amshochas, which have got in themselves Ayinian from Shaloi Be'erach, and it's called Cyrus, nonetheless it's all in that first Aliyah Sarotzen in Arich, that's called Seidah Hishtaushel, or the Rotzen for Seidah Hishtaushel. Kol Mokim Yosef Rak Shoyrish Anei Tzolim. Since, however, it's only Kaviochel Shoyrish Anei Tzolim, Al Kain Ef Sheshayum Shuk Mimeno Ye B'Chochma Rak Alidei Ye B'Chinas Cyrus Levad. V'loi K'moi Michochma Labina Shehu B'derech Ileva. So says the Rebbe, with that expression rak, we have to be careful what he means. Mikol mohim leyosi rak shoyrish. In other words, that the rak is kilo not terribly cutting off. What it means that he's only shoyrish on netzalim. He's not really netzalim. He's not really close to netzalim, even though he's their shoyrish. In other words, he's the shoyrish of netzalim, like rotzen can be a shoyrish to something. So even though rotzen is moved out from all things that it wants, but there's a rotzen which is close more to a seder. So we saw that was the Aliyah Sarotzen, to bring about the whole seder of Hishtaushel. Therefore, you can't really say that Arich is a close mokeh v'shorish to the Sfiras and Atzilas, because it's rotzen. Yeah, it's moved over here. Yeah, it's close to them in the sense that it's the rotzen already, how it's been megala itself for that inyan b'miyuchad that it will bring about lahatzil eventually livroi. So therefore he says, yeah, it's a shoyrish to the netzolim. But since it's only a shoyrish and not mamish begolu to them, then it can only be nimshach into chokma derech cyrus. In other words, that even from arich, yeah, the ikar gilu is to chokma is derech cyrus. V'loi kemoi mi chokma labina shehu derech ileva. Although that's what we saw in the previous chapter, that once you get into the actual spheres, beineihem and bein atzmom, then it's a inyan from ileva. It's a inyan from ileva olo. So that's what we've sort of been through this whole inyan in Oishis Acherim in the previous chapters, and that when we said that the Hatzisavas of Chochma Gluya and Atzilas from Moiches Timor was derech Cyrus, meaning how the Cyrus are a gilui of the kiruv of the Makif of Oyer Yosha to the Makabli. In other words, that whole Makif, which is our chitzenius Moiches Timor, with a Makif, but derech kiruv ela Makablim, and that's his rotzen to bring about the union of spheres and eventually livroi. Therefore, the siders which are nimshochim are b'derech kiruv to the union for Chochma, even though they're siders, and therefore, generally speaking, they're seidahi. The difference is that that's siders, and once you get into the spheres, then it's iliva. V'agam the abova eimor. Now this is not arikno. This is what Chochma bina. V'agam the abova eimor gam kein malbishim lezroya is the arich. Shezeu amshocha shaloi alidei siders. Zehu mipchinas zayin tachtoinim the arich ampin. Aber mit Gimel Rishoina is the Arich ein nimshach rach alidei Cyrus Levat. So here the Rebbe comes up with a kasha what occurs in numerous places in Chassidus, this type of kasha, and that is we find that one of the main places where this becomes mentioned, and Mavua, is in the Siddur of the Alter Rebbe in the Haggadah Shel Pesach, but again to Yetzias Mitzrayim. And we said, what do you mean that we went out of all Medidas Vagbolas in Yetzias Mitzrayim? There was Eden from the Pari became bottle and the Eden went out. Well, that was because the what you call Abba Va'emo, how they are in Atzilas, they were Malbish the Zroyo is the Arich Anpin. In other words, that the arms, or what you might call the muscles of Arich, came down and entered B'pnimius into what is the Mokkeh of say the Stausers in the spheres of Oilam Asatzmom, in Mamela that became a big yontu that Mamish the Lamaila Mi Medida Vagborach, like we just saw, it's always Shurish Mokitan Nerto, it's not Nertolo, it's Shurish Mokitan. That came down and entered Mamish Chochma Bina, and remember that caused the Yitzhia in Chochma Bina v'kol ha-mishtaushel imiyem, ha-Yitzhia mikol ha-medidas v'agbolah. That's called Yitzias Mitzrayim, and that's the whole, one of the big kavonas on the Laila Seder, that Zroya Ishtarich Hanpin mislabshim b'Abba v'Ema. Mamela, that took everything out of Seder HaIshtaus. So the Rebbe said, Lafizeh kum to is that there's such a thing where Ari can be mamish mislavish in Chochma Bina. And he was saying, no way. The only way Chochma can be makabel from Ari is Del Cyrus Buvar. So what's the difference? The Rebbe say that the Zroya is mamish, they're the Zroyas of Ari Hanpina mamish mislavish in Chochma Bina. Then that means that Al Choponim, the Midas, Royas means the Ina for Midas, Al Choponim, the Midas of Arich, Mamish Mislavi Pepnimis in Chochma Bina da Atzilas. And here we say, no, that Chochma is only Mekabel, and Silas we pointed out is only a Ina, particularly when it's coming B'derech Oyar Yosha, then Silas is only in for Tzimtzum V'Chitonius Bilvad. So what's it the Indian? So the teretz of them. The Kamer Makayim says that En Nachanami by Yitzias Mitzrayim there was Taka Gilif and Arich, but it was only Mizayin Taktoinim da Arich. It was only from the Midas. And therefore Zroyois da Arich means Chesed Ugvura. And Mamir it was only from the Midas Chagas, Nahim and Malchus. But that's the union of Zayin Taktoinim. Avo Migimor Rishayim da Arich. And now that'll be Nicha, that'll make good sense, because Gimel Rishayis means Moichas Timor. Gimel Rishayis means Mamish Tina for Chokma, this the Arik, which is Moichas Timor. And Mamela from Moichas Timor to be Nimshach in the Chokma, that's only the side as Bilvad. Over the lower levels of Arik, ain't no Chadami, they can be Nimshach, but they're Pnimius into Chokma Ubir. Until we say the Chochma Bina a malbish the Zroyas of Arikhan. And Mamira, what's the beer with them? Over there in the city we make a huge big Harikut Yontef out of that. That the slabs of Arik the Chochma that caused Yitzias Mitzrayim, Yitzhia Mikol Medizas Vakbolas, and Pari became bottle because his Achiz was also in Arik Yadua. What they're going to do is as he became bottle and Mitzrayim became bottle and all the Giluim of the Laila Seder, and they're going to Inyan, why do we say that that's only Kilo Zayin Tatoinim, because it's not yet Mamish the Amitis Inyan of the Gilui of Arich be Atzmusa, which is Gimel Rishayin. So we could say that the Nakuda is like the Alter Rebbe brings over there in Perek Lamed Aleph, that Ein Nachanami Yitzias Mitzrayim was a tremendous Inyan of it had in itself a certain Inyan Ki Boracha Am. It had a Inyan from Bricha. But the Inyan from Bricha means that Tzokosov, not the Yidden were ready for that really, and not the world was mamish ready for that. In other words, that not Yidden were mamish a Keili, as is one on, they weren't a Keili yet. They had to be the Orin from Sfiras Oima, even though the Sfiras Oima wasn't a mitzvah yet at that point. Or it had to be a Miyain, Sfiras Oima Kamu in the Ran at the end of the Psochim, that they were Zeichet to Sfiras Oima, they counted with the Gantzarichas, even though they didn't actually have the mitzvah, v'chule. And then there was all the Indian of V'yer Ravaya, Al-Hazen, they came down specially, and Kilo, it all had to get together in a way that they weren't really mamish mitzad pnimis avidosam. I feel like the Sfiras Oima, they weren't really mamish muchonim. If a middle be eager, it was no Mailala Lamata. And that's what the Rebbe says here, that the whole Yitzhia mi Medida Vagbola was only, ultimately speaking, a relative Yitzhia. Even though boys are regular, Gabi Mitzrayim, it was enough to be Mavatal Mitzrayim, it was enough that didn't should be able to go out, I feel Lamaila Me'ateva. Although later they had to get cracking in order to get to Mount Sinai and to receive the Torah, and there had to be some form of further developments, and be Ike, what you might call a tremendous Yerida, Milmaila, but that's the other the Shmaya. And therefore, said the Rebbe, sof, it's only a slabshus, pnimius, a design taktoinim of the Moche V'Shoyes. It's not the immediate sin in the Gimel Rishonos, what's Boiches Timor Mamish, that can't come by even because that can only come by in a Ashayres. We're heading for bigger things, as you might say. The ultimate Amshocha we're looking for is Mamish, the Amshocha Moiches more of a ratio to Lois Yada, and that's going to be Nimsha. Yeah, Kuidam in our even when it comes. Yeah, Bederach Chitainis, like we saw. Yeah, and then ultimately there's going to be these scholars at the Pnimis the Atzmi Shaloi Hoya Bekila Bekol Arotzen to say the high Stalzelas. And the Ike in that is Leos. The Ike Sleimus at their meaning is Leosid Biscalas Hakrev and Melech. Yeah, because Galus Hakreva for Melech HaMashiach. Oh, man. Rabbeinu Shalom Ad Masa.
Ad Masa.
Mit die ganze Riches. It said the Rebbe that's not a kasha. Is a Avo Migimul Rishonos Dari Ein Nimshach Rahale Dibchin Cyrus Levad. Omikol, okay? Nikra Amshocha Zu Seide Hishtalshalas. Even that is called Seide Hishtalshalas. Even when it's Nimshach, Derech Cyrus. And we get the whole Gili from Moiches Timor Mamish into Chokma Datzilas. Nonetheless, that's also Seide Hishtalshalas. Amshocha, Him Bechinas Arich Anpin. Emes from Gimel Rishonos, Obasok Kolsor, yeah, it's from Arich. In other words, like we saw the Makif Doer Yosho, which is Shaitan Makabnim, Yeshu Beminin Esesfira. Other Rabbi said the Rabbi, the whole Inyan from Arich, if we go, Mitzad, here we mean the close Inyan of Arich, if we go Mitzad the Sphiras Adiyah, Mitzad Chitzayni Yusom, it's well known that there's a famous Lashon, Lefiyomim, Akesa Nimne, Beminin Esesfira, Lefiyomim, Ein Akesa Nimne. So if you go mitzad the Chitzonia Sainyonim, then Keser is Nimna as one of the Esesphiras. And what is that? That's Inyan von Arich. Yeah, the close Inyan von Arich is Nimna as one of the Esesphiras. So he said that Inyan of the Amshocha from Gimel Rishonos, albeit the Arich, albeit even that it's Chitzonia is, the Makif of Yoshu Bilvad, he said that's how it is, that Arich is Bemini Esesphiras. For who shares on Ne'atzolim, it's still the Inyan which shared to Ne'atzolim. V'hinei said already Amshochas HaSayres hein mi Moiches Timor. Ach so mibchinas Chitzonis the Chochmas Timor. Hainu mashu moki lechochma. V'hainu b'chinas HaSosum shelagabi HaMekablim. Well, that's what we've been learning all the time. Now the Rebbe restates it. Or that whole Seder, how from Moiche Chochmas Timor, you get, albeit Inyan von Cyrus, and you get into Chochma Datzilas from the Gimel Rishonos of Arich, albeit, but since it goes in that even which is the Makif Doer Yosho and so forth, so Shaitan the Mekablim, therefore it's all, as it were, Inyan von Chitzoini, yes. V'yal Kain, Amshocha Zu, Hagam Shi'ali Dei Cyrus, Arizeh B'chinas Hishtalshalas. So that's what we just must be. That the whole Rotzen originally in the Aliyah Rotzen, Kedem HaTzimtzum, Afistalshalas, was koilul in itself that there would be certain kiluim shaloi b'derech ilava all. B'derech Cyrus, and albeit b'derech Naila in the Inyan von Cyrus, Makif to Yoshua, but albeit a Makif, so it's all Niklal in that original Rotzen of Seder Hishtalshalas. Sure. Even though we had a big sort of cash in the middle from Zroya Starich Hanpin with the answer this, so that we get back to the whole Inyan that the Amshocha from Moiches Timor to Chochma Datzilas is Derech Cyrus, and in an even from Chitzonius Cyrus, Chesokosov, it comes from the Makif of Oyer Yosho Ashayach El Mekab. Omno. Amshocha shel Maila legamri misay devad drog is Now it's interesting to notice that whenever he's so far said this, the Rebbe, he's used the word legamri. In other words, that we're jumping quite in a high darga. When we say we're now going into the Pnimis Inyan, we say that this is lemaila legamri, completely beyond the whole Inyan of the Hadroga of Ishtaushalas. And ultimately you're staying in the same place in a way. You're still in Moiches Timor, or in Moiches Timor you're going into the Pnimius Shabo. There's a word of Machiv der Choyze Shabo. How she's Choyze betoich Atzmusa, and not even from Aliyah Vistalus Bepnimiusa. And what is that? We saw that was Atik. Pnimius, Atik. It was the Atik. Atik is an Indian for Ner Takva. V'nivdal is something which is Mudal Betachlis. From the Makablim. That was the Rebbe, that Pnimius of Moiches Timor, that is legamre lamaila misayda vadrogas eishtauchles. He said, "Hu mashanim shub meprinas reisha delois yada she'ena b'minyan eresesfiras." Even though that's Moiches Timor, and Moiches Timor is chokma in arich, but he said that's not nimna in ishtauchles. Meaning that what is nimna in ishtauchles, close arich, is nimna in ishtauchles. That's only the chitonius from Moiches Timor, but not the pnimiyas. He said, "Dan tu chad v'loi b'chushban." He said, that's the union of what we say, antu chad v'loi b'chushban. Now, what do we mean by saying antu chad v'loi b'chushban? It's well known that the etzem musik van echod, the etzem musik van echod, l'choyle, includes that it's a dover hamanui. If you say echod, then you imply shtayim v'sholem. Echad is called what we call a mispara siduri, or a mispara manui. In other words, you say echad, you imply the inyan does. However, there's another inyan in echad, what it's brought down, the famous beer and citizen, the Sifri, yesh echad v'yein sheni loy. There's a certain echad, but there's no sheni to him, even though he's echad, but ain't sheni loy. And what is the beer with them? The beer in them is that even though there's a certain nasinus mocking to the inyan of protim, but nonetheless all those protim are all misachtim or misbatlim, they're like abidaretim. In other words, you've already gone out of the yochid of the etem, you've gone into protim already, or in those protim they're all misbatlim or misyachadim in the inyan of the aleph alufay. Even that they're mamish one beetle, one klolestika in a beetle. That's the pshat antu chad, and therefore we have to say v'loi b'chushban. We have to be shoylel the inyan hachushban, because l'chera chad implies a inyan shochet, and therefore we say this as amadrega, which chad v'loi b'chushban. Now, why do we have to be shoylel here the inyan from chushban? Because sof kol sof Moiches Timor is in arik, and therefore he says that's as amin inyan, that even though it's there, but it's not. It's in the inyan from the chushban, but it's not there. It's moved from the inyan from chushban in Ganze. In other words, that really sof kol sof, that's a yochid. That's a inyan from yochid. Now, we bow that as gefinzach in the whole seder, which eventually leads to protim, and to a certain extent, it's one of the protim in a way. Aber mitzad atzmiyusay, this is loy b'chushban. Like I'm removed from the whole cheshbon, and therefore that's the lashon of the Sifri. Yesh echad ve'ein sheni loy. That's a inyan from echad, aber in echad gufa l'mayla legamri from any seder of manui, of any seder of a seder. And therefore, antu chad v'loi b'chushban. But nonetheless, we still have to be shoylel the minyan from chushban. And that's it. From Reisha Deloy is yado. But it's well known that Reisha Deloy is yado does a pnimis atik mamish. But this, in the Gimel Reishin, it's well known as the Gimel Reishin, of which Moiches Timor is one of them. The highest of them is pnimis atik mamish. And so pnimis atik is mislabish. In other words, that the highest Reisha is mislabish in the next Reisha. In other words, in Moiches Timor mamish is mislabish Reisha Deloy is yada. And he's ein b'minyan ha'esesfiras Down to Chad B'Lev Choshvan. V'gam Hamshocha Zu. And even this Hamshocha, Hagam Shezo Hamshocha Shelo Elidei Adoris Ishtalsheles, Muchrach Leided, V'li Mosheich Derech HaTzinoides, V'cholal HaSayres. So the Rebbe said that even this Hamshocha, which has got no shaykhs to that original rotten of Ishtalsheles, and it's not in the whole definitional status of Ishtalsheles. It hasn't been nikva, be'inyan Ishtalsheles klal. He said, nonetheless, it's also muchrach leire derech atzinoires. Now, here we see this word muchrach again. And that's what we spoke about earlier in the Shia. What's the taich muchrach? What does it mean, muchrach? So that's what we're mavaya, that here we're talking about Hamshochas ha'etzem. Hamshochas ha'etzem can only go through a tzamtzemus, it can't just be nimshach k'moi shehu, because it's l'mayla me ha'ora, l'mayla me helam v'gilui, it's the etzem. And therefore you can only bring the etzem if you do something with it. When you're talking about ha'oras, then ha'oras can just be nimshach k'moi shehem. You can have a ha'ora which is l'mayla, that's soyiv, you can have a ha'ora yesem matumtum. But when you're talking about the etzem has to go, and that's why they use the expression muchrach. Yeah. And the Yesh Loimer that he doesn't use the word muchrach here in the normal way when we say muchrach. We say that was the way the Eibshter wanted. That's why it's called muchrach. Here, ulai, the word muchrach is even more. That if you want to bring mamish the whole etzem into a small area, then it can only go when the etzem itself goes. Well, that has to be. It can only be by, almost you might say by definition, by etzem abiyu sepedora. It has to come through this inyan of a tzimtzum ha'achmi. And therefore he uses the expression once again. But notice that he says it's muchrach la'ide v'li mosheich derech hatzinoiros, and here he puts in for the first time v'cholol asayros. Now up to now we haven't stressed the cholol of the side. We haven't really made a issue out of that. We've just said that sayros are even tzimtzum mesuyam, not like hileva. Yeah, that we've spoken about even slowly. It's a form of chitzenius azamin. In other words, we've been talking more about what you might say the etzem, how do you call it, the reed of the sayah, rather than the pnimis of the sayah tutur. But here he says clearly that it's the inyan of the cholol asayros. In other words, that pnimis of the sayros gufa, or the etzem just goes down. Through them, like the famous moshel of the funnel, like a boat. As in Ayin Ches, the Rebbe's got a whole view over there, and what he calls a mashpeik. What a mashpeik means, a funnel. Yeah. So it said, Limoshi derech hatzinoides v'cholol asayres. Ki bechinas atik u'moiches timo atzmon. The pnimis of them. Dainu bechinas pnimis moiches timo. Shu moichet atiko. Shesosu mitad atzma. We saw that's the maki for voyel choize, the pnimius, mamish of moiches timo. But that's sosum, mitad the mikablim, not just mitad the mikablim, sosum mitad atzma. Kenal efsher sheyove lidei gilui rach alidei she'oiver. Once again, notice the expression efsher sheyove lidei gilui rach alidei she'oiver v'nimshach derech yud gimel tkunei dikna shemitzamtzem b'cholol hasaro. Now here we see once again Ashinu in the Lashon, which is mamish modia, what I told you before. Mitzamtzem means that not something is being mitzamtzem, not some koyach miba, you might say, how would you use the expression, not a koyach mibachutz is being mitzamtzem. No, the Indian is mitzamtzem. It in its own self has to be withdrawn into the mashpei, into the funnel. Yeah, and it allows that to happen because that's the way it's going to get to you. And where does that happen? In the cholol of the sayah, not in the chitzenius of the sayah. No, dafki in the cholol of the sayah. Yeah, v'hagam. He said, even though this is not a ha'ora, and that he's now strengthening that argument. This extra sentence here is like a chizuk to that idea. He said, if it goes to a sayah, then it's only a ha'ora. He said, no, that this amshocha is not nimshach by way of ha'ora. Kemoy amshocha mimpchitz chitoini etzakesa b'chokma derech zayit, like we saw from the chitoinius of moiches timor into chokmas timor. Kiim shenimshach b'chinas ho'atzmuth. Here, now here's unusual. In the Lashonos of the Rebbe Rashab, mitten derinnen, that he should use an expression like that. Ki'im shenim shebechinas ha'at. In other words, does it the Atzmi himself. In other words, that ultimately speaking, if you throw the right card on the table, you throw the right ball, then what you're really doing is throwing the Atzmi. So Eila Chanami later on we call Etzem HaOyer, Shalamayla we call Gilui HaOyer, v'chudei. So the Rebbe does this for the Atzmas. For all points, it's got the same klolium as Atzmas. It can't be Nimshah B'derech HaOra. Now that's a pillar. And that's Yesh Leima. Now that's a whole inner we spoke about before. That's going to be Eliyasid Love. Eliyasid Love, well, that's going to be the cloud. That the Atzmius is going to be Nimshah. Good. Okay, guys, we'll hold there because I got to done by the own tonight. My first mutter to the outside does on Kaddish. So I got to get things ready over there. Also make sure the bottom coming at the right time and everything. So we'll pause there for this evening. We're holding by a very good Indian, and then he goes on to say that's the Emes Hamshocha Pnimiyas, the Nimshach Ha'atzmiyas. That's the Emes Hamshocha Pnimiyas. In other words, that the Emes Hamshocha B'derech Pnimiyas is the Atzmi. Whatever Ha'oras come Derech Pnimiyas, that's not such a big deal. Whatever what the Atzmiyas come, that's the ultimate Kavona in Pnimiyas. For what to do, Shinoiros and Inyonim do Velches Skate Pnimiyas is ultimately we want to bring the Atzma. And that's the Inyan from the Atzma. Nowadays when we talk about these sort of things, you just get from Moichen to looks from everybody, People are from Atat, it's Moshe Mashiach.
Yeah,
Has to come Mashiach.